Hi, Dr. Pulsifer here to talk this time about alternate history, where we propose historical what-ifs, some of which are quite possible seeming and some of which are more stories than real history. It's speculative history. What would have happened if? What if something had gone differently? What if someone had made a different decision? What if something as simple as the weather had been different? For example, at Waterloo, where Napoleon was not able to attack until nearly noon, if the rain had not been there, he almost certainly would have won that battle long before the Prussians turned up. Sometimes this alternate history can be expressed in rule changes to an existing game, and sometimes it can only be expressed with a new standalone game. Now, if you have the point of view that history is inevitable, then this may not make much sense to you. I've discussed that question in a separate screencast. For me, history is a combination of chance, individual choice, mass psychology, climate, geography, and other factors. What actually happened was only one of many possibilities. Some of those things, especially individual choice, are quite variable. What happened historically may not even have been the most likely thing to happen. For people who have that point of view, alternate history can be quite interesting and makes a lot of sense. There are also advantages for the game designer. The great advantage of alternate history is there's no player hindsight or foresight about what actually happened, because we're assuming something different happened. So at least for the first play of the game, there's all kinds of opportunities for surprise and uncertainty that aren't in many historical games, because the players don't know the exact history. Now, miniatures war games do this a lot. They make up scenarios that are battles that never happened. They may not change other circumstances, but at least it's a battle that never happened. Unfortunately, miniatures to me are not a good test of history, not even in the tactical realm where they live. And of course they're tactical, and so that doesn't apply to a class about strategic wargame design. Some people would say that alternate history, or at least what-if history, ought to be part of historical games. So historical games should include what-if or alternate history scenarios as a matter of course. And again, this could be as simple as changing the strength or the percentages in a tactical game or the weather at Waterloo. Video games really ought to offer more opportunities to do this than tabletop games, because they have a storage capacity that tabletop games just don't have. Now, lots of people like to create alternate history, usually not for games. Some of those are very elaborate, such as Harry Turtledove's novels. And Turtledove, of course, has a PhD in Byzantine history. Most of them are not so detailed. I have a very thick book of alternate history essays from many writers, including Winston Churchill. If you know much about Winston Churchill, you can imagine that he was quite interested in alternate history. And we have to say, many alternate history stories are much more story than they are believable reality, because the causality or supposed causality is simply not there. Now, what do I mean by nonsense causality? Let's take an example. People often speculate about the possibility that the Mongols would have conquered Europe if the great Khan had not died and the Mongols streamed back to choose a new Khan. But in practice, steppe nomads never could conquer Europe, because the last grassland in Europe, at least in those times, was the Hungarian plain. If you don't have grasslands, you can't have a lot of horses, and so you can't have steppe nomads. Now, the Huns lived in Hungary long before the Hungarians moved in, who were the Magyars, and both the Huns and the Magyars raided deep into Europe, but they never conquered it nor even tried. They went back to Hungary. Moreover, Mongol times was the era of castles, and by this time stone castles, very strong castles, which made conquest of any significant nation almost impossible at that time. And we can consider that the Mongols took 52 years after Genghis Khan's death to conquer southern China, which is much closer to home than Europe. And that conquest finally was completed in 1279, whereas the death of the Great Khan and so on is when the Mongols invaded Europe in 1242 or thereabouts. So, the idea that the Mongols could conquer Europe was nonsense. But it might make a good story. And in a game you have to decide, are you focused on the history or the story? And I always like to point out the word story is in the word history in English. And there's a reason for that, perhaps. It's up to you. Now, if you're going to do this, of course you have to choose your history. You have to decide what you want to change or what you want to emphasize. It doesn't have to be a completely new game. It can be a variant of an existing game. For example, alternate histories have been proposed for my game Britannia. Sweep of history games like Britannia are particularly suitable for alternate history because they are history in broad strokes rather than in details. I'm listing here some geek lists, which are lists of games that use alternate history. And these, of course, are tabletop games. I list them here because it's a convenient thing to look at if you're interested. I'm sure you can think of video games that are also alternate history games. Many of the Sweep of History video games can have, say, Macedonia conquering much of Europe. They are more alternate history games than real history games when you come down to it. And I'm talking about games like Europa Universalis and Total War and so on. Games that cover all of Europe, for example, or all of the world. And that's another consideration. You can make this alternate history game and ignore lots of things, and in other words, focus on the story, or you can make the alternate history game and try to focus on the history and see what happens. It's a choice, and either choice will work if that's what you want. So while this can be all good and good fun, alternate history can also teach you a lot about the real history. Thanks for listening.